They threatened Ukraine.
Возьмем Киев!
И Киев будет взят так быстро? 1,5–3 дня.
2 дня, а потом падение города.
В горячей войне мы Украину победим за 2 дня. Чего ее побеждать-то, господи?
They audaciously saber-rattled towards the abhorred collective West.
Превратить США в радиоактивный пепел.
Demonstrated weapons that don't have any analogues to the world and themselves. They had been nurturing patriotism and cultivating pride for their army for decades. They literally instilled the legend of the invincibility of the second army in the world in Russians. But the war in Ukraine has shown that the myth of the power of the Russian army is literally hyped, as well as all the part of the equipment. When and with those help was the legend about the greatness of the second army in the world created? And who gave this honorable place to the Russian armed forces? Watch in our special report on greatness of the second army in the world. Who and when created the myth of the invincible Russian army? February 2022, Russia is finishing pulling the military equipment to the borders with Ukraine. This process started in autumn 2021. Hundreds of tanks, APCs, helicopters, and 150,000 of the military concentrated around the whole border on the territory of Belarus and regions of the Russian Federation neighboring Ukraine. The second army in the world is getting ready to invade the independent sovereign state, disguising these plans as military exercises with Belarus. In a few days after these launches from the complex OTR-21 Tochka during maneuvers, cruise and ballistic missiles would strike all over Ukraine. And the second army in the world would break into the borders and invade Ukraine. Within 3 days, Russian military command was supposed to report about having captured Kiev and get ready for a parade on Khreshchatyk, but the Russians were stopped on the outskirts of Kiev. In Bucha, where the army of rapists and torturers conducted a massacre. And in Hostomel, where the airdrome was kept at the cost of enormous effort.
Эта война продлится, Володя, ну максимум 3–4 дня.
Exactly here on Khreshchatyk in Kiev, the second army in the world was supposed to conduct a military parade, and it actually happened. The parade of charred, crumpled scrap metal into which the equipment of the Russian invaders has turned. Never had Russia such enormous losses in any war in such a short period of time. Defeat near Kiev was just the beginning for the Russian armed forces in Ukraine. That was a huge disappointment for the bigots of the war. Putin's army, praised for years, was expected to conduct a blitzkrieg and brilliant military operations. No one even questioned its greatness for a second. So where does the myth about its invincibility and in general about the second army in the world come from? Let's figure it out. Tank biathlon. Weapons which have no analogues. Their endless military parades.
Возможности комплекса не может превзойти ни одна система ПВО зарубежных стран. Сделали авиационный комплекс грозной сдерживающей силой. Тактическое авиационное крыло Красной площади подходит группа из 10 самолетов.
Russians were consistently fed up with all of this for years. Myths of the invincibility of the Russian army had been instilled in the world for decades as well. Leaders of foreign states were present at every parade. Foreign observers were present every time Russians conducted military exercises. They had foreign guests at every exhibition of military equipment. Journalists of international publications were competing for the most impressive headline connected to the newest Russian armament. There all the time was enough food for thoughts, constant reminders of nuclear weapons.
Аналогов ему в мире нет и еще долго не будет.
Demonstrations of the Poseidon nuclear torpedo allegedly capable of sinking Britain. Trials of the Sarmat heavy nuclear missile with a range of 18,000 kilometers. Like 10 of these can completely destroy the United States. Assurance that Russia was the first in the world to create and produce a whole line of hypersonic weapons. And finally, icing on the cake.
Использование искусственного интеллекта. Речь идет о высокоточном оружии и робототехнике.
Such speeches about the unique armament of the Russian armed forces were broadcast everywhere. As a result, they firmly entrenched in the minds of Russians.
In the evening of every day, they showed that Russian equipment doesn't have any analogs in the world. The best tanks, super hypersound, weapons that can pass everything, bomb everyone.
The authorities and propagandists armed themselves not only with fables about their modern superweapons, but also with a flattering rating, in which Russia has been in the second place in the list of the strongest armies in the world for 12 years in a row. This is the Global Firepower Rating. In Russia, Global Firepower Rating has become a real pillar of the authorities. Its experts are called either military analysts or an international company, or an independent American research center. The creators of the rating claim to be using dozens of parameters to determine which countries has the greatest military potential, starting with the population and the defense budget to the number of aircraft carriers and coal production. And the main factor and fetish of Russian military greatness is its nuclear arsenal. Russian authorities brag about having a triad, that is 3 types of weapons: ground, aerial and naval.
Да, для человечества это будет глобальная катастрофа. А зачем нам такой мир, если там не будет России?
And propagandists warn everyone who may be questioning Russian military capabilities or resources even for a second. You shouldn't compete with Russia.
Ни в одной войне не может быть поражения у ядерной державы.
But the greatness of the army turned out to be imaginary. None of those so-called latest developments in the sphere of armament promoted to the whole world not only have never been used in the battlefield for more than a year of the war in Ukraine, but have never been seen by the Russian army as well. The main battle tank of the Russians, T-72, was equipped with a tower with dynamic protection against an armor-piercing projectile. As we can see, it didn't help. Typhoon. This was called the most protected and was considered the pride of the Russian military-industrial complex. It burned down in the Sumy region. In the war against Ukraine, Russia, boasting of the presence of modern high-precision and powerful weapons with no analogues in the world, used outdated models of military equipment. The situation with an honorary index of military power is not so clear too. The Global Firepower Rating, beloved by the Russian authorities, propagandists and citizens, is considered to be a pseudo-rating by military experts and analysts.
The material does not contain links, and there is no explanation of the algorithms that would allow such conclusions to be drawn. I think this is someone's attempt to give the society information about the armies in the world and monetize it via advertisements. It hardly has some methodology. Creation of such rating is literally impossible.
The truth about the rating was reviewed in an investigation by Bellingcat journalists who specialize in fact-checking. Global Firepower is connected with a web entrepreneur who makes a living from clickbait sites. In addition to the rating of the armies, the businessman's interests include a site constructor of dinosaurs and even an aggregator of patent decorations. These are the sources of information of the Kremlin propagandists. Creation of such a rating is beneficial for Russians, says Harry Tabach, US military officer, captain of the first rank.
I think these are Russians. The Russians launched launched by themselves, as far as they couldn't say that they have the first army in the world. All of us laughed that they were so modest, giving themselves the second place in the rating of armies in the world.
And these are not groundless accusations. The rating cannot be objective. After all, it does not take into account either the superiority of technology or the firepower of weapons, or the training and motivation of military personnel. For example, United States has 11 aircraft carriers, China has 3, and Russia has 1, and they have not been able to repair it for 6 years. In terms of the number of tanks, the Russian Federation takes the first place, but global firepower does not consider quality. For the rating, the German Leopard 2 or the American Abrams is the same suit as the T-54, the same age as Putin, or the same as the vaunted Armata, a promising tank that managed to stall just at the repetition of the parade on the Red Square. Military budgets. This year, the president of Russia is going to spend a third of his country's budget on the war in Ukraine. But $143 billion is still 1.5 times less than in China and 6 times less than in the United States. Finally, let's look at how much the rank and file earn in the so-called top 3 leading countries, of course not including additional combat payments. A recruit earns $1,650 a month. At the same time, the army pays 100% of the cost of studying at the university and even for obtaining a degree. This is in addition to home loans and low-interest mortgages. The monthly salary of a motorized rifleman in China is from 500 to 900 yuan. It is about $100 a month. It seems to be little, but at the end of a 2-year service, the demobilized person receives about $22,000. And this means that on average his monthly salary is about $1,000 US. And finally, Russia. Before the full-scale invasion, the salary of an ordinary contract soldier was neither more or less than 30,000 rubles. It equals $360. And to earn more, you need to die or become disabled. Such ratings not only cannot be 100% objective and accurate, they are inappropriate as well. It is reasonable to compare the resources of the armies only of those countries that at least theoretically may find themselves in a military confrontation, says retired captain of the Israel Defense Forces Gregory Tamar.
Why? Because military confrontation means the invasion of the army onto the territory of the enemy. The Brazilian army cannot invade Vietnam and vice versa.
Tamar says that the combat effectiveness of the army must be assessed on the basis of training, managerial experience, skills of leaders and technical support of the army. And always motivation and adequacy of combat mission must be taken into consideration. During the Arab-Israeli war in the middle of the last century, Israel was attacked simultaneously by 5 armies of neighboring states, with heavy weapons, aviation, artillery and armored forces.
However, the motivation of the Israelis was so strong that they managed to defeat the army that invaded the state, although they suffered serious losses. The Israeli army is a good army as a result of almost 80 years of fighting there. But if tomorrow the Israeli army receives an order to capture Argentina, occupy Argentina, will the Israeli army succeed? No, it won't work. Should the army be blamed? No, the army won't be at fault for this. Those politicians who gave such a crazy order will be responsible for this.
The situation connected to the main component of Russian greatness mania is not as good as the propagandists promoted. The real condition of nuclear arsenal is unknown. After all, the missiles were built at the Ukrainian Pivdenmash, which stopped servicing them after 2014. In Russia, there are no such specialists, and some of the carriers are completely outdated. This means that both of the rating and the myth about the military power of the Russian Federation are literally blown out, similar to the part of its equipment. But on the Russian TV, no one ever says it. They will feed you up with pathetic tales. Almost all content is created with the purpose of cultivating patriotism and a sense of duty to the motherland in Russians. After all, almost the entire human resource is potential future soldiers.
Putin! Putin, президент мира! Война за Россию! Матушка!
Culture, music and cinema creation is involved in the myth-making.
So many fiction films have been shot, series have been made in order to make this myth popular, including even pop music. Rastorguev, Gazmanov. Here is a return to the military teams: Pravos, Hussars, World War II, partisans, officers.
Already familiar propagandists create the appropriate ground for the support of the mess of the invincible army. They reassure that the equipment of the NATO countries is nowhere near the Russian analogues. For example, tank Leopard 2 can be destroyed with shovels.
There were so many stories about American equipment that it will not handle some kind of Russian soil, or it will fail, it will fall apart, that it is very delicate, fragile weapon of poor quality. But there is our shovel, it is ready to chop tanks, their cheap metal.
Here are the trials of the Swedish AT-4 grenade launcher at the Ukrainian testing ground. And here the NATO weapons are being checked by a pro-Kremlin military observer without reading instructions.
Ладно, давайте сделаем обзор, пока у меня окончательно не заплыл глаз. Вот почему я говорю, что натовское вооружение – это
The Russian military is not afraid of the American Patriot air defense system, transferred to Ukraine by partners. Putin himself assured Russians on TV.
Мы пощелкаем и Патриоты там.
And the greater the losses of the Russian army, the more desperately they are trying to save its face. Half of modern Russian tanks have been destroyed in the battlefield in Ukraine. In general, the loss of armored vehicles exceeded 10,000 units. The airspace forces lost more than 600 planes and helicopters, and the loss of personnel is about 200,000. Due to the lack of shells, the tactics of the barrage among the Russians turned into the tactics of cannon fodder, explains Andriy, sniper of the Horde unit, with the call sign DID.
Go and die, do whatever you want. It doesn't matter to them how many of their soldiers will die to advance their ammeter to 3. They crawl and they are killed. The next group is literally crawling through the bodies of the fallen, they are killed as well. And just like that, they constantly go in such waves.
The sergeant and officer corps were also exterminated. The elite special forces were destroyed almost completely, first near Kyiv and then in the Kherson region.
When they were liberating Kherson, we paid attention to the replacements. Some of their units, some of their airborne forces units were changed 2 or even 3 times. That is, they were destroyed to the scratch. 2 very strong motorized rifle divisions were destroyed, and very important Wagner officers, indeed combat ones, were liquidated in the Kherson direction. This as the deputy chief of staff of Wagner and officers. For the first time I picked up an AK-12 rifle. This is the only one, we do not have it in service. This is the only one, there are no analogs.
In order for the Second Army to have something to fight with, Russia had to reopen and start restoring equipment of the Cold War era. But it is very hard to quickly recruit personnel and find high-quality personnel. The thinned ranks of soldiers are replenished with prisoners, murderers, robbers and rapists from the penal colonies.
Война тяжелая. На всякие там чеченские и так далее близко не похоже. Расход боеприпасов у меня приблизительно в 2,5 раза больше, чем в Сталинграде.
They mobilized, recruited 300,000 people into the army, but the war and equipment turned out to be not the same as in the grandiose parades on TV.
Все разломано, все кровати сломаны, воняет мочой, печек вообще нету на всю палатку. Ладно, печка сломанная, а напомню, на улице сегодня минус 25 градусов.
Нам, офицеры врали в лицо, что мы тероборона. В итоге сейчас вышел подполковник, сказал, что первый раз это слышит. Оказывается, у нас просто стрелковое подразделение, мы штурмовики. Мы штурмовики, мы не тероборона. А нас сейчас только об этом...
Мы автоматы еще даже не видели. Нас в прямом смысле слова ведут на убой. Вчера должны были отправиться на штурм. Штурм был необоснованный. Просто как на пушечное мясо.
Pleasing Putin, the commander-in-chief sends for the slaughter their most valuable resource, their soldiers. The Second Army has been led for 11 years in a row by a person without any military education, the person who has never served in the Russian army. This is unacceptable for any other country in the world. Experience in building and work in the Ministry of Emergency Situations have not helped Sergei Shoigu to build a really strong professional army and learn how to plan military operations.
Очень много потерь, ждали Голова колонны попала в засаду. Командир полка погиб. По остальным разбираюсь. Оттуда били артиллерия, танки. С беспилотника, так я понял, байрактары летают.
The war exposed the scale of thefts in the army. Corruption in the Russian Ministry of Defense, entrusted to Shoigu back in 2012, is called total by the American Institute for the Study of War. And this is one of the reasons why the formation of a combat-ready and motivated army in Russia is impossible.
Смотри, военторг, индивидуальное испытание. Это какой-то смотри. Срок годности 15-й год. 15-й.
The culture of lies and theft. When people are afraid of telling bad news to the commanders, but jump over it among themselves and safely steal and sell everything, played a bad trick. Something was stolen at the level of the Ministry of Defense, something at the regional level, something at the district level, and mere pennies reached the army. Indeed, our main ally is Russian corruption.
But finally, the myth of the greatness of the Russian army was broken by itself, not only by their failure on the battlefield, but with the cruelty and atrocities in the occupied territories, with massacres of Ukrainian civilians, with attacks on civilian infrastructure, with tortures and murders of unarmed prisoners. For the entire civilized world, the great Russian army has become an army of looters, rapists, sadists and executioners who have committed all possible war crimes. And this image will not disappear in the years to come. They violated all customs of war, all international conventions.
This is not an army, this is a criminal terrorist organization. Therefore, I disregard them. There is no honor, no valor in it. It's fake. This army is fake. This army, the myth of this army was completely destroyed by the Ukrainian military. All these fictions, all the stories that they would wash their boots in the English Channel in today's turned out to be false. Fiction.
In 2023, Global Firepower traditionally updated the rating of countries all around the world, and again gave Russia the second place, despite the colossal losses of equipment and personnel. There is no need to discuss the objectivity of this rating. Putin's army, which was going to wash its boots in the English Channel, washed itself with blood in Ukraine, suffering a defeat on the battlefield, achieving only non-military but criminal goals, attacking peaceful cities with Iranian drones. The army of the Russian Federation is not up to the title of the second army in the world. Not by equipment, not by preparation, not by moral principles, and even the Russians themselves no longer believe in the myths created by lush parades, furious propaganda and high evaluation of the pseudo-analytical side. Konstantin Pavlov, Special Report.